Welcome to the writer's review of Lines of Departure by Marko Kloss. We'll start out the review as always with the main spoiler-free section and then move on from there. So, Lines of Departure is the second book in the Frontline series. If you haven't read the first book in this series, I'll have links to that review on screen now and in the description down below. On the other hand, if you have already finished Terms of Enlistment, then you'll find this novel more or less familiar in terms of style and storytelling. There are a few differences between the two, of course, the first of which is a slight alteration to this novel's subgenre formula, and this novel is also somewhat faster paced than Terms of Enlistment, and that's mostly to do with the author being able to jump straight into the action without the need for a lengthy setup. Andrew remains the sole point of view character in the novel, and the story continues to be presented from his first-person present tense account of events. The plot picks up about 5 years after the conclusion of the previous book, with the first half centering around the Freeway War, which develops between the two main human blocks and the alien menace, with the second half then being centered around humanity's defensive measures against the lanky threat. And at the same time, this latter half also hints at the socio-political effect that an existential crisis like an alien invasion would have on a nation, which later ties heavily into the plot of the two subsequent books in this series. So in terms of subgenre, the action and drama make up the backbone of this novel structure. The action is dispersed throughout the entire length of the novel in short chapter-long bursts, although it is more prevalent at the start and very end of the novel itself. If you've read the previous novel, you know how intense these sections can be, and in this novel, the action sequences are mostly ground combat focused, although there are a few space fleet engagements depicted as well. Meanwhile, the drama elements make up a large part of the middle to later sections of this book. They mostly deal with the blowback Andrew receives for the choices he makes in the action-oriented sections of this book, although a lot of drama also comes from the infighting between two of the big military branches, which develops throughout the length of this book's plot. Romance was one of the core elements of the previous book, but here these elements are severely dialed back, mostly due to the course the plot takes throughout the length of the novel, and especially in the latter half. These romantic elements do make a strong comeback in Angles of Attack, which is the third book in this series, so you at least have that to look forward to if you like these romance elements in Terms of Enlistment. And in terms of other smaller subgenres which make up this novel, we have comedy, which continues to bring a bit of levity to this story, much like it did in the previous installment in this series. Then we have philosophical elements, which mostly deal with the question whether soldiers have a duty to follow orders or their morals. And in terms of world building, we have further development of the Lankies and descriptions of a few more planets. In terms of other quirks, I've already mentioned that it features a first-person present tense account of events. This lends itself perfectly to the action sections, since it adds an extra level of immersion and tension to these combat sequences. It also has a unique take on the asymmetric warfare between humans and an alien species. In this case, that's partly due to the Lankies' physiology, with them being genocidal dinosaur-sized monsters, and also in part to their technological superiority, which poses a serious hindrance to humanity in the overall state of the war. Of course, much like the previous novel, this one features one hell of a big explosion, which I'm always personally a fan of. So, in conclusion, this book is available in ebook, paperback, and audiobook formats. I personally really enjoy this book and can wholeheartedly recommend you continue on with this series, especially if you like the first contact portion of the last book, since this book is a direct continuation of that plotline, and the narrator again does an outstanding job voicing all the different characters. Just in case all this didn't convince you yet, I'll leave some general ratings on screen now that other people have left on this book. In terms of length, the novel falls in the 90,000 word range, and the audiobook comes in at 9 hours long. As usual, the ebook version is the cheapest by far, although in this case the ebook plus audiobook WhisperSync deal comes in at just under $5, so make sure not to waste your Audible credits on this novel. And as always, I'll leave the current pricing linked down in the description below. Now I'll be going into the writing lessons that I took away from this novel, so if you want to avoid spoilers, click off the video now. But before you do so, I do suggest you consider leaving a comment down below on your own thoughts on this book. So this novel carries a lot of the same lessons that I covered in my previous video, the first of which is the portrayal of the asymmetric combat. The previous book already established that the Lankies are a very hard to kill species, but that only really applied to when after they made planetfall, since their space assets weren't even mentioned until this book. In most sci-fi series, this ruggedness would directly transfer over to their fleet, so they'd still be killable if enough firepower was directed their way, but in this novel the author makes a point to show that these aliens are virtually unstoppable in space when he shows that a single one of their ships can wipe out an entire human task force without any real difficulty. This, in my opinion, gives the whole war against the Lankies a whole different dynamic, if you can even call it a war at that. Sure, the author does reveal that relativistic impactors can take them down, but despite that, he endeavors and even manages to keep this asymmetric power dynamic in play until the 6th book in the series, and this constraint leads to many cases of original creative storytelling along the way. The second lesson I'd like to cover is how the author went about changing the subgenre structure of this series. In the Kloboves reviews, I already covered how adding a subgenre midway through a series can be a good thing, if done right of course. Here we have the polar opposite taking place, as the author strips away almost all the romantic elements which featured so heavily in the previous installment. At first glance this might seem risky at best, since readers of the first book might continue reading the series, specifically because of the romantic aspect to the books, and at worst they might think why even add the romantic subplot in the first place if it becomes irrelevant later on. To make sense of this decision, we have to take a look at the overarching outline of the series itself, and you'll know exactly what I'm talking about if you've already read Angles of Attack. The omission of the romantic elements serves to create an air of distance between Andrew and Haley, which then acts as one of Andrew's main motivations for his actions in the latter half of this novel and throughout the entirety of Book 3. All of which culminates in a very satisfying and humorful reunion of the two characters, which otherwise wouldn't have such a strong emotional payoff. Well, that wraps up my review on Lines of Departure. I hope you enjoyed this video and found it informative. If you did, consider liking and sharing it, and if you have any thoughts on the book or anything else I covered in this video, I'd love to read about it in the comment section below. With that, I'll see you on the next writer's review.